From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Near completion. That is how President Donald Trump is describing the U.S. war with Iran. In his latest address Wednesday evening, the U.S. president pointed to what he called overwhelming and decisive victories, arguing that Iran has been crippled and that the U.S. no longer needs foreign oil. But back home, the costs of victory are coming into sharper focus. Gasoline prices has climbed over $4 a gallon, and public patience appears to be wearing thin as the conflict stretches on. Meanwhile, with the tensions in the Strait of Hormuz still high, China and Pakistan are putting forward the alternative path, a 5-point initiative centered on a ceasefire, renewed dialogue, and adherence to the UN Charter. So how should we make sense of U.S. President Donald Trump's latest remarks, and how can a conflict this scale truly be brought to an end by simply and unilaterally declaring victory? Now joining me in Beijing is Ben Norton, editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. From Detroit, we have Saeed Khan, associate professor of Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies at Wayne State University. Also joining us from San Diego is Brendan Andrews, entrepreneur and former Hill staffer. And with us here in the Beijing studio, we have Professor Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. Ben, let me go to you first. We've just heard from the U.S. president claiming what he called swift, decisive, and overwhelming victories in the war against Iran, insisting that U.S. objectives are now near completion. Let's listen in.
In these past 4 weeks, our armed forces have delivered swift, decisive, overwhelming victories on the battlefield. These core strategic objectives are nearing completion.
Near completion. Ben, what do you make of what Donald Trump just claimed?
This multiple times, and then he immediately contradicts himself by threatening to bomb Iran's electrical infrastructure and escalate the war. There are also many reports that the U.S. is sending troops to the region, potentially to try to take over Karg Island, a very important island for Iran, where a majority of its oil exports pass through, and also it's used to store its oil. So I'm quite skeptical of this narrative from Trump. I think this is part of his strategy. Nixon used to use this strategy. They call it the madman strategy, where you constantly contradict yourself, you seem crazy, so your opponent really has no idea what you're going to do next. I should point out that there was a report in the New York Times recently, just a few hours ago, that a top former Iranian diplomat who previously served as the foreign minister, who was allegedly helping to broker these negotiations between the U.S. and Iran with the facilitation of Pakistan. According to the New York Times, the U.S. and Israel just bombed him, and he was injured and his wife was killed. This is the man who is supposed to be helping to broker these negotiations. So I think this is why in Tehran there's so much skepticism about this narrative from the U.S. that it's serious about peace and diplomacy and negotiations. We've seen this happen again and again. Anytime the U.S. claims it wants negotiations with Iran, the U.S. uses this as cover in order to carry out another surprise attack on Iran. And many of the Iranian negotiators have been killed by the U.S. So when Trump says the war is over and he says that now they're going to seek peace, well, we'll see what he says in 12 to 24 hours, but I think it's quite likely he'll contradict himself again.
It would be stunning if what New York Times has reported, the killing of a senior Iranian diplomat, an intermediary, important one, is injured. That would be a big news. Now, Brandon, do you see Donald Trump's proclamation of a victory, ways of ending the war soon, just a pretext, a cover of launching even more aggressive strikes against Iran?
Well, in terms of the military strategy, the U.S. military leadership has come out and said there are 13,000 targets that they'd like to hit in Iran, and they've hit about 11,000 of them so far, and that they need a couple more weeks to hit the subsequent 2,000 to be able to complete the initial mission in military terms. But as we all know, war, conflict on any scale is political and military. And in a political, military, and also economic sense, we did not get answers in terms of a way out of Iran for the United States, and most importantly, for many people around the world, a way to return that Strait of Hormuz to free travel that's unencumbered by either payments to Iran or the threat of vessels being destroyed by Iran. So, in strict military terms, yes, there's been progress made, but in economic terms, and those are the kinds of terms that are most definitely impacting constituents in the United States and people around the world, there's still a lot of questions to be answered.
Yeah. Let's talk with the state of war. Professor Han, the U.S. is expanding, not winding down its presence, according to multiple sources and satellite images and reports. The U.S. says George H.W. Bush has been deployed to join the Lincoln and the Ford, creating an unprecedented three-carrier buildup. And at the same time, thousands of troops from the 82nd Airborne and amphibious sources aboard the USS Tripoli are moving into the position. How should we understand all these postures amid Donald Trump's claims that the war is ending soon?
Well, I think there's two things that we have to look at in this case. I mean, one is that the Ford is actually moving away because it seems as though it has suffered some damage. There was a fire on board, and it looks like it's also had some other mechanical issues, including clogged toilets. But I think it is still significant that there are three aircraft carrier groups in the region. Part of the reason we can also deduce is because America's footprint in the region when it comes to its military installations have been severely damaged by Iranian attacks. When we look at military bases in Qatar and in the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait, and also in Saudi Arabia, where we find that very sophisticated reconnaissance and radar warning planes have been hit on the ground, it seems as though the United States is now having to rely more on its Navy and particularly its attack carrier groups. At the same time, it's also important to remember that the United States has a proxy in the form of Israel, which is conducting a lot of the heavier bombardment of Iran currently. So in that sense, the United States really doesn't seem to be retreating. It's just shifting gears as to what resources of its own it's using and an intensification of the Israeli presence in the attacks on Iran.
Right. Regarding America's ultimate objectives, Donald Trump says one day that it is about regime change, and the next day he says that it's not about regime change. So on the question of the ultimate goal, President Donald Trump's messaging appears to be increasingly inconsistent. Let's listen into what he just said.
But I mean, I want to see no nuclear weapon, but we also want regime change. Regime change was not our goal. We never said regime change, but regime change has occurred because of all of their original leaders' death.
So, Professor Liu, what is it that the United States, that Donald Trump really wanted out of this war against Iran?
Well, today people are not really surprised about the ambiguity created by Donald Trump in terms of inconsistent message and also his style of decision based on playing by the ear. So right now, in terms of the priorities, of course, denuclearization is the one that is called on the support of the international community, not to mention his own constituencies, which is considered to be justifiable. But for the regime change, it is very difficult to really describe what type of regime that can be there in shape and what are those candidates that can be there to further manage or govern this country, and also in what way can that type of candidate be created. So will that be more predictable than the existing one? So and the third one would be also the to push Iran new quote-unquote regime to be there to refrain from sending what is termed as terrorist support to some other regions. So these are their to be very much selective in the mouth of Donald Trump in pacifying some of the opposition, and also by creating a sort of the contingency plan on whatever can be achieved. So in that way, he can easily decide, okay, I will end this war by a short-term gain or achieving one objective, or the other is that if he sees that it is really a softball to play, so he can really stretch on. So pretty much he's really playing a ambiguity and also contingency strategy towards the main stakeholders.
Yeah, really. Thank you for all these layered analyses. Important for us to understand what's happening in Iran and also in the United States. Now, Ben, when it comes to what Donald Trump hoped to happen against Iran versus what's really happening inside Iran, there's a discrepancy, isn't it? If you look at the blood feud, right? The son succeeding the father as the ultimate, the supreme leader of Iran. If you look at the institutional resilience, a process that has long been in place to select Iran's supreme leader in case of an Israeli or United States decapitation. All these processes in place in Iran. Can Donald Trump really proclaim a regime change or a total victory despite all these facts happening in Iran?
No, you're absolutely right that the Iranian government has shown that it's very resilient, and there are several strategies that have been implemented by Tehran. One, in terms of its military leadership, is the military implemented what's known as the decentralized mosaic defense strategy, where basically the command structure is decentralized and you have smaller units of the military that can operate somewhat autonomously. So they're prepared for this war to continue for an extended period of time. The US and Israel think they can simply assassinate all of the military commanders and that the military will buckle. But in fact, it's a relatively decentralized structure, which, by the way, is quite reminiscent of what Vietnam did, the National Liberation Front in Vietnam did during the Vietnam War. Now, in terms of the political leadership, there's another similar structure where all of the top positions in the Iranian government have multiple people who are designated below the sitting official. There's a chain of command, and if and when the official is assassinated, and the US and Israel have assassinated many officials, there are multiple people designated to succeed them. So Trump thought that they could carry out these so-called decapitation strikes and simply overthrow the government. And this came, of course, just a few weeks after the US essentially invaded Venezuela, bombed Venezuela, and kidnapped Venezuela's internationally recognized president, Nicolas Maduro. And the US said that it carried out regime change in Venezuela, which, by the way, is not true either. The acting president of Venezuela was the vice president under Maduro, Delcy Rodriguez. She's the sitting acting president right now.
And the son is still a parliamentarian,
a
very senior leader in the Venezuelan parliament, heading a Chinese-Venezuelan friendship committee.
Exactly. So Trump says that he carried out regime change in Venezuela. It's not true. He thought he could carry out a similar operation in Iran, but Iran has also demonstrated that it has much more capacity militarily to retaliate, whereas Venezuela does not have a substantial military in comparison. And I think the US government also really did not anticipate the asymmetric tactics that Iran has used, especially the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. There are reports that Trump was surprised about this, which is actually quite shocking because Iran has been talking about this for many years. But I think now Trump has gotten himself in a situation where he thinks he has to continue to escalate in order to claim some kind of victory. I know he's saying that they already won, but it's clearly not true. I think this is part of another deceptive, cover story. And the U.S. does plan on escalating further and sending troops to the region. But this is only going to have the impact of solidifying popular support in Iran for the government, because even many people who had been critical of the Islamic Republic are now essentially rallying behind the flag because they recognize that they need to defend their country's sovereignty amid a foreign war of aggression.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Brandon, what would be a viable exit strategy for Donald Trump? What would be an off-ramp for Trump at this point, in your opinion?
All of the original targets outlined by military leadership in the United States have been hit, that they've been destroyed, and so it's mission accomplished. Now, that wouldn't address the Strait of Hormuz, that wouldn't address the political leadership in Iran, that wouldn't address the economic issues driven by the strangulation when it comes to 20% of the world's oil supply. However, he could certainly claim victory there and move on. The next step is, how do you, as the Trump administration, address the economic piece that is so important now to constituents in the United States? If you look at Donald Trump's approval ratings when it comes to his uh, effect on the US economy, it's gone down by 8% overall. It's gone down by 14% with Republicans, and it's gone down by 23% with Republicans under 45 since January. So his numbers are going down, and higher gas prices and higher prices for many other things, inflation, which is something that he hit Joe Biden on over and over again during the last election, that could come back. And if he decides to claim victory based on hitting these 13,000 military targets without completely addressing the Strait of Hormuz, then
Hmm.
he will lose at home while potentially claiming the victory overseas. So, yes, you can claim this victory when the military targets have been hit, those 13,000 targets, but without having some kind of strategy to completely address the Strait of Hormuz, there's going to continue to be issues for the Trump administration. And the issue is, no one in the United States wants to see ground troops at any level invading any country, even with the understanding of the importance of the Strait of Hormuz and the understanding of the 47-year history of the Iranian regime, chanting "Death to America." No one wants to see boots on the ground, and
Yeah.
so it's a very difficult place for the Trump administration to be in. But it's a place that they place themselves in by moving to take this action under what many would claim to be
Hmm.
dubious motives.
You know, what's also interesting is the fact that complicating the situation is a message issued by the president of Iran, President Masoud Pezeshkian, has taken the unusual step of addressing the American public directly, insisting that Iranians, quote unquote, harbor no enmity towards ordinary Americans, and saying that Iran's actions are in self-defense. Professor Han, does this message from the Iranian president an attempt to, of course, bypass U.S. government and appeal directly to the U.S. opinion, but to what end?
Well, there's two major objectives for the president's statement. One, as you rightly said, is circumventing the rhetoric, the propaganda, and the distortions of the Trump administration, and particularly President Trump. And we heard two very dishonest statements that were made in the speech, at least. One was claiming that Iran was behind the bombing of the USS Cole in 2000. That, of course, was substantiated to be Al Qaeda. And the other was the number of casualties in December and January when it came to the protesters, the president saying 45,000, which is a gross over exaggeration of the number. So the Iranians recognize the level of deception by the president, and they are appealing to that sector of the American public and the American electorate, which has basically become exhausted with this president, with his inconsistencies, his unpredictability, and of course his dishonesty. And we see that in the polls, that even from his base of support, he has really eroded a lot of the approval that he had once enjoyed. I think the bigger problem, though, that the United States is going to face is that they have really cornered themselves into a quagmire. If there is going to be an on-ramp, that's also going to be contingent on Israel. Because if the president makes the case that America's military objectives have been achieved, then it doesn't really explain why Israel would then continue with its military campaign, something that Israel has said they're planning on doing irrespective of what the United States is planning to do. So that's going to create another anomaly, that's going to create another inconsistency. And so if there is going to be an on-ramp, not only does that require negotiations, perhaps the Chinese and Pakistani plan, but also bringing into line Netanyahu and the Israelis so that there can be some kind of a resolution here. And that seems rather elusive at this point.
You know, what's also important is oil prices. To average Americans, global oil prices have surged after President Trump's latest address, signaling that markets remain unconvinced that any disruption to the Strait of Hormuz may ease soon. But it's ordinary Americans and consumers worldwide who are footing the bill. Here's what Trump said. Let's listen in.
Many Americans have been concerned to see the recent rise in gasoline prices here at home. This short-term increase has been entirely the result of the Iranian regime launching deranged terror attacks against commercial oil tankers in neighboring countries that have nothing to do with the conflict.
So, Professor Liu, oil prices and LNP prices are rising. The consumers and investors are not totally convinced. How should we read this?
Well, I think for ordinary Americans, they are not very much aware of what is going on, but their opinion with the White House is pretty much dependent on the gas pumps rather than his allegedly diplomatic strategies whatsoever. So when they do feel the pain, particularly the low-income households, they get more of antagonistic view against him. And now for some of the more informed Americans, they would read the message on a dual-track type of approach. One is that if it is really there to address the U.S. security, and if that's going to be a short-lived type of operation, or if there is a clarity in the objective that is there to be achieved, which is more convincing, then they would be more supportive. So it's really pretty much on how the entanglement can be going on, and how the Strait of Hormuz can be managed for a smooth navigation. So it seems that definitely there's a general disappointment with his not only the action, but more important with his rhetorics as what can be achieved, because the gas pump doesn't lie. And with him getting more deceptive over all the promises and over all the communication with the U.S. people. And for the global community, they are also looking at the situation where he can really manage the situation, particularly the neighboring countries surrounding the Iran, whether they are being negatively affected either in terms of the economic gains or humanitarian losses. So therefore it is really a time of test, whether there's a clear objective and whether it's going to be a strategy that is that have a very clear timeline.
Yeah, there have been a humanitarian crisis as we speak. A quarter of Lebanese has been displaced. People in Iran, in Gaza, some in Israel. I mean, let's not forget about the human sufferings anywhere we turn. Now, I want to show you something that is very interesting. The ongoing war is increasingly fueling concern and division within the United States. A recent Reuters and Ipsos poll shows that more than 60% of Americans disapprove of U.S. military strikes on Iran, as you can see on the big screen, highlighting a clear erosion of public support. So, Ben, does this suggest that the U.S. military campaign is moving ahead of the public consent, and more broadly, are Washington's strategic decisions becoming increasingly a political burden for the Republicans going forward and for Trump and his base?
Well, I'll start with the second half of your question. There's no question that this has become a burden for Trump, especially with midterm elections coming up in November. It's quite ironic because when Trump campaigned for president, he said that he would be the peace candidate. And in fact, in his victory speech in November, he said, "I'm not going to start wars, I'm going to end wars." And specifically, he said that he would not wage war on Iran. So he so clearly broke all of those promises, which did anger a lot of his previous supporters. Although I should point out that according to the Reuters poll that you mentioned, it showed that 80% of self-identified MAGA Republicans support the war, whereas around 30% of non-MAGA Republicans support the war. So we do see a division even within the Republican Party. Trump supporters are going to support him no matter what he does. You know, Trump famously said a few years ago that he could go out to the street and shoot people and his supporters would support him. And, you know, he is right, because we see that he claimed he was not going to bomb Iran. Now he's bombing Iran, and his MAGA base does support him. But within the party itself, there are major schisms, and certainly among Americans overall, this war is extremely unpopular. Now, getting back to the first part of your question, what's unique about this war compared to previous US wars is it has been unpopular from the very beginning. Now, if you go back to the Iraq War, a few years into the war, it became extremely unpopular. So for this war against Iran, the longer it goes on, the less and less popular it will get, which is another reason why I think Trump, at least publicly, says he's going to end the war soon. But as I said, I'm skeptical as to whether he'll actually do that. He's trying to manage popular opinion at home. But unfortunately, we've seen in recent history that U.S. public opinion does not have a big impact on foreign policy. Many of the foreign interventions carried out by the U.S. have not been very popular, but unfortunately, public opinion doesn't have a big impact.
Fascinating discussions. Now, we'll have time for one more question. Professor Han, China and Pakistan have proposed a 5-point initiative calling for immediate ceasefire, peace talks, diplomacy. How do you look at that?
Well, again, this is promising to see the kind of intervention by Pakistan, which has had a historic role in being a conduit between China and the United States. But as was mentioned earlier, with the targeting of one of the chief negotiators for Iran right now, it's not very certain about whether there's really an appetite for negotiation. We saw negotiation for the nuclear deal just 24 hours before the attacks of February 28th in Geneva. So the idea of the duplicity of the United States as well as Israel on whether there is a move toward a negotiated settlement remains an open question. At the same time, there is so much erosion of the American standing around the world reputation-wise that you see this playing out, for example, with the Chinese bond market now improving at the expense of the American bond market. People are pulling their money out of the U.S. markets. We're also seeing that other countries, including China, are able to pay for oil in the yuan. So you're seeing the diminution of the exclusivity of the U.S. dollar. These, of course, are probably too complex and sophisticated issues for the average American to really be considered. Like I said, it's what the price is at the pump. But the overall direction that America is going is not very promising here. And that's going to remain to be seen if it's enough of an impetus to have an on-ramp for the war.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. We learned a lot. And that will do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. Stay tuned and see you next time.